A man went to shocking extremes, ordering poison off Amazon to end his wife's life. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling truth behind a crime that no one saw coming. Pause for suspenseful effect. Don't miss the jaw-dropping twists. Watch till the end to uncover the dark reality behind this twisted true crime. He clicked the Order Now button, his fingers trembling. The screen blinked back at him. A bottle of poison, labeled clearly, arrived on time, delivered straight to his door. It felt wrong, but it felt necessary. The weight of it in his hands, cold and lifeless. He could almost hear her laughter in the other room. She had no idea. She never did. A glass of wine was all it would take. She'd sip it casually. And then gone. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. The walls felt too close. The air too thick. It was a hot night, but the chill crept into his bones. A restless sweat trickled down his neck. He tried to focus. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. A deep, unsettling silence that made the seconds drag. His wife hummed in the kitchen, the clinking of silverware as she prepared dinner. He stared at the bottle. It seemed to pulse with its own quiet power. His hand hovered above the bottle, as if the air around it burned. He didn't want to touch it, but the plan had been set. The decision had been made. She didn't deserve this, did she? But the thought evaporated as soon as it came. She never knew how much he hated her, how suffocated he felt in their life together. She was happy, and he was dying inside. The door to the kitchen opened. She stepped into the living room, smiling. He smiled back, but his stomach twisted. What was he doing? Her face lit up with the kind of joy he used to crave. She didn't know what was coming. He set the poison on the counter, carefully. Her back was turned, so she didn't see. He mixed the wine. Just a little. A drop of poison. Invisible. Odorless. He waited for the glass to fill. Then he felt it, the moment of decision. Everything had led to this. Everything. Her voice broke through his thoughts. Are you okay? She asked. He smiled again. This was the moment. He handed her the glass.
Here, he said.
She took it without a second thought. She drank. And waited. The silence in the room deepened. The seconds stretched. He stared at her, frozen. Then, the room began to spin. The room began to spin. His vision blurred. He felt a cold sweat form on his brow. His heart raced in his chest. Thump, thump, thump. She stared at him, her lips slightly parted. Her eyes held no suspicion. She smiled, content. The minutes dragged on, but nothing happened. His stomach twisted in knots. What if it didn't work? What if she didn't drink enough? What if it was all for nothing? He tried to calm himself, but it was impossible. His breath came in shallow gasps. His hands trembled at his sides. He couldn't look at her. She was still talking, oblivious. But her voice started to fade. A ringing sound filled his ears. His pulse quickened. What was happening? The color drained from her face. Her eyes widened in confusion. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak. But no words came. He watched in horror as she stumbled backward. The glass fell from her hand and shattered on the floor. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the couch. He didn't move. He couldn't move. His breath caught in his throat. The room was suffocating. Too quiet. Too still. Her chest heaved, shallow gasps of air. Her eyes flickered toward him, panic setting in. "Help me," she whispered. He stood frozen, unable to speak. Her hand reached out, trembling. Her grip was weak, desperate. He didn't want to help her. Not anymore. Her face twisted in pain, her breaths growing more erratic. He could hear the frantic beat of her heart in the silence. A strange satisfaction washed over him. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel so empty. He thought he'd feel relief. But all he felt was dread. Her movements slowed. Her eyes fluttered shut. The room felt colder. She was slipping away. His heart hammered in his chest, louder than before. He took a step back. The weight of it hit him. He didn't want her to die. Not like this. He never wanted it to be like this. He stood there, paralyzed. Her body was still, but her chest moved faintly with shallow breaths. Panic clawed at him. What had he done? The bottle was still on the counter. The poison still there. And it was too late to undo it. He glanced at her. Her face was pale, drained of color. Her lips, once full of life, now barely parted. The faint sound of her breath filled the room. It sounded wrong.
Too weak.
Too fragile. He stepped closer, unsure of what to do next. Was it possible to reverse it? Could he save her? His mind raced. But no solutions came. Only the cold, hard truth of his actions.
He was trapped.
A deep, suffocating silence wrapped around him. Her hand twitched, and for a second, he thought she might wake. But the twitch was all. She was gone. Her eyes, once warm, now stared at him blankly. The finality of it hit him like a wall. He had crossed a line. He couldn't take it back. Her lifeless body on the couch mocked him. The room felt as though it was closing in on him. The walls pressed in, the air growing thick with every passing second. How could he have been so blind? His pulse thundered in his ears. His chest tightened with guilt. He should have stopped. He should have never gone this far. But now it was too late. The doorbell rang suddenly, piercing the silence like a gunshot. He froze, unsure of what to do. The sound of footsteps on the porch. Someone was here. A knock echoed, sharp and urgent. The police? Had she somehow? His heart pounded harder. Who else knew? Who else had seen the poison? His body tensed, every muscle on edge.
What now?
Would they find him? Would they see through the facade? His thoughts spiraled as the seconds stretched into eternity. Then the knocking came again. Louder. Closer. He swallowed hard. The doorbell rang once more. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. He stood frozen, his mind racing.
Who could it be?
Was it someone who knew what he'd done? His heart pounded in his chest, suffocating him. The room felt like it was closing in on him. Another knock, this time more insistent. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. His eyes flicked to his wife's motionless form. The blood drained from his face. He couldn't think, couldn't move. He had to do something. He couldn't let them find her like this. But what if they already knew? What if they were here to arrest him? A dark thought crept into his mind.
Was this it?
Was this the end of everything? The knocking continued, now accompanied by the faint sound of voices outside. A faint murmur. A conversation. His breath hitched. He had no time left. His mind raced for an escape, any escape. He turned towards the kitchen, then back to the door. But what could he do? His eyes darted between his wife's body and the door. The seconds felt like hours. He couldn't leave her like this. But he couldn't stay either. What if they found him standing over her? What if they could already hear the panic in his heartbeat? The voices outside grew louder. Closer. He stepped towards the door, shaking, every movement feeling unnatural. His mind was a whirlwind, everything spinning out of control. He reached for the door handle. His fingers grazed it. Then he froze. A voice cut through the chaos. Police. Open the door. His stomach dropped. The truth was closing in. The weight of the poison still lingered in the air. And he could no longer escape. The words echoed in his ears. Police. Open the door. His pulse quickened, panic rising in his throat. He froze, his hand still hovering over the door handle. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to act. But what could he do now? What was left for him? The room felt smaller, suffocating. The silence of his wife's still form weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. He thought he had prepared himself for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he realized he wasn't ready at all. The doorbell rang again. Louder this time. A final warning. His breath became shallow, his chest tight with the looming presence of what was to come. He took a hesitant step back from the door. What if they already knew? What if they'd already seen something? What if they were here because of her? His mind raced, but his body felt paralyzed. The police were right outside. If he opened that door, everything would come crashing down. The thought of them walking in and finding her lifeless on the couch made his stomach churn. His fingers gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles turning white. He had to make a choice.
Now.
The doorbell rang once more, sharper this time. The voices outside became more urgent, more demanding. His eyes flicked to the bottle of poison on the counter. The label still clearly visible. His heart was pounding so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. Another knock. The voices grew louder. Closer. They were about to break the door down. He had no time left. There was only one thing he could do now. One final decision. He turned away from the door and made his way toward the back of the house. His legs shook as he moved. He had to escape. Before they found her. Before everything he had done was exposed. But as he reached the back door, something stopped him.
A sound.
A voice. "Sir," it said, calm and steady. "We know you're in there." His heart dropped. It was over. The voice outside was clear, unyielding. "Sir, we know you're in there." His breath caught in his throat. The back door, the one he had planned to escape through, now felt like a trap. He stood frozen, his legs trembling beneath him. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. The weight of his actions bore down on him, crushing him in the silence. His wife lay motionless on the couch, oblivious to the unraveling storm. But the storm was here. It was closing in on him. Another voice, louder this time, called out, "Sir, this is the police. Open the door now." The pounding in his chest quickened. What could he do? There was no escape now. His mind raced, frantic, scrambling for a solution. But there was nothing. No way out. He was cornered. The door in front of him suddenly felt miles away. And the truth was barreling toward him at full speed. His thoughts spiraled. His fingers twitched involuntarily. The bottle of poison gleamed in the dim light. He remembered the cold satisfaction he'd felt earlier, the thrill of the plan unfolding.
But now?
Now, all he felt was dread. The knock on the back door came again, harder, more forceful. A chilling realization hit him like a blow. They weren't going to leave. He could hear their voices now, speaking in hushed tones outside. They knew. They knew what he had done. He staggered backward, his hands shaking. The air in the room felt heavier than ever before. His throat was dry, his body numb. It was too late. The door creaked, the sound of a key turning in the lock. They were coming in. The door opened slowly. And there they were. Two uniformed officers. Their eyes scanned the room, and then locked onto him. Their gaze was unblinking, unwavering. He could feel the weight of their stare on him. And in that moment, everything he had done, everything he had tried to hide, felt exposed. The room seemed to close in around him. His heart raced as the officers moved closer. One of them looked down at his wife's motionless body. He felt the flood of guilt rise in his chest. His mouth went dry. One of the officers stepped forward, his voice firm. "Sir, we have reason to believe that your wife is in danger. We need you to step aside."
He wanted to speak.
He wanted to tell them everything. But his throat was dry. His lips couldn't form the words. Everything was slipping away. The officers moved past him, their footsteps echoing in the silent room. His body felt rooted to the spot, as if the weight of his actions had become too much for him to bear. The air was thick with tension, suffocating him. They knelt beside his wife, checking for a pulse, speaking in calm, steady tones. He could hear their words, but they seemed distant, muffled. His mind was racing, but his body refused to cooperate. One of the officers glanced up at him, a frown creasing his brow. "Did you give her something?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. He couldn't answer. His mouth felt dry, as if his words had been stolen from him. Another officer, younger this time, took a closer look at the bottle on the counter. His eyes widened as he recognized the label. "Is this what you used?" the officer asked, his tone no longer just professional, but filled with a quiet accusation. The bottle of poison seemed to glow under the harsh light of the kitchen, a reminder of the horrible choice he had made. He swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach tightening further. One officer stood up, his eyes fixed on him. "We need to get her to the hospital," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. But it was too late. Her lips were already cold. Her chest was still. She was gone. The truth settled in the room like a dark, suffocating cloud. The officer called for an ambulance, but there was no hope left. They knew. They could see it in his eyes. The officer's gaze didn't leave him, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. "Who else is in this house?" the older officer asked. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying sharpness, a need for answers. "No one," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers didn't respond, but they were already processing everything around them. He was trapped. Every step, every decision had led him here. The door was still open, the officers' presence filling the house, their weight heavy in the air. He looked down at his wife once more, her lifeless body now a symbol of everything he had destroyed. The room seemed to close in around him. The walls, the air, the silence, everything pressing down. One officer moved toward him. "We're going to need to ask you some questions," he said, his voice hard now. It was too late to lie. There was no escape from the truth anymore. And it hit him like a blow to the chest. He was caught. The officer's words rang in his ears, loud and final. "We're going to need to ask you some questions." He nodded slowly, his throat dry, the words barely leaving his lips. There was no fight left in him. No way to deny what he had done. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him like 100 tons. He felt the walls close in, the air thick with the stench of his crime. The officers moved toward him, their presence like a force of nature, unstoppable. One of them took out a pair of handcuffs. He didn't resist. What was the point? It was all over. He had made his choice. The cold metal clicked around his wrists, and his chest tightened in response. He glanced at the door, but there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide from the truth that was closing in on him. The other officer turned toward the counter, picking up the bottle of poison, inspecting it closely. His eyes flicked back to him, and the realization hit like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. The officer didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said it all. They knew. They had known all along. It wasn't just about the poison. It wasn't just about his wife's death. It was about everything he had hidden, everything he thought he could keep buried. The officer stepped forward, his face expressionless. "You'll be taken in for questioning," he said, his voice calm, but there was no warmth in it. It felt like an eternity as they led him toward the door, his mind racing, but his body unresponsive. Each step was like a weight on his soul. Each step was a reminder of everything he had done, everything he had ruined. He glanced over his shoulder one last time at his wife's lifeless form, still and cold on the couch. Her face, once full of life, now only held the emptiness of what he had stolen from her. The officers didn't look back. They didn't need to. The truth was already laid bare. And it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in his chest, deep and final. As the officers led him away, his mind was numb. His eyes fixed ahead, but his thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in a web of guilt and regret. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into his skin, a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed. He could still hear her voice, faint in his memory, as if it were calling him from the past. But it was too late for any of that. Too late for the love they once shared, for the moments they'd lost. Everything had led to this. Everything. The streets outside seemed foreign, the world moving on without him, as if nothing had changed. But he knew it had. Everything had changed. The officers didn't speak as they guided him into the squad car. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in his ears. As the car pulled away, the silence felt suffocating. There were no more lies, no more hiding. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. The house, his home, was far behind, but it still loomed large in his mind. The house that held the memories of his choices, the ones that would haunt him forever. He stared out the window, but he wasn't really looking. He was lost in the aftermath. Lost in the knowledge that there was no undoing it. There was no returning to the life he had once known. The police station came into view, a cold, imposing building that marked the end of everything. They pulled into the lot, and the car came to a stop. He felt a strange, hollow emptiness settle inside him. They led him inside, through the sterile hallways, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. It was all moving too fast, and yet it felt like it was moving too slow. He sat down in a small, stark room, the cold steel of the chair pressing into his back. The door shut behind him, and he was alone. Alone with his thoughts. Alone with the crushing weight of his actions. He had killed her. It had been his decision, his plan. And now he was paying the price. The door opened after what seemed like an eternity. The officer walked in, his expression unreadable. He sat across from him, pulling out a file, flipping through it. Then he looked up, and there was no mercy in his eyes. "Do you understand what you've done?" the officer asked, his voice quiet but firm. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? What was left to say? The officer leaned forward, his gaze never leaving him. "We've got everything we need," he said. The finality of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no more hiding. No more pretending. He had done it. And now there was nothing left but the consequences. The officer's words hung in the air, heavy with finality. "We've got everything we need." Each word seemed to drive deeper into his chest, pushing the breath from his lungs. The silence between them stretched on, suffocating. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, tight. What was there left to say? What was left to feel? He couldn't look at the officer. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him, the cold, hard surface reflecting the truth he could no longer escape. The officer flipped through the file again, his fingers tracing the paper with a calm, methodical motion. He didn't need to look at it to know what was inside. He could feel the weight of it, the evidence, the proof, the final judgment. The officer finally closed the file and set it down on the table with a soft thud. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You'll be processed soon," the officer said, his tone neutral but sharp. The words felt like ice. He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The door opened, and another officer stepped inside, his expression just as cold. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to ask any more questions. They knew everything. He had already told them, without words. His mind felt numb, disconnected from his body as if it were all happening to someone else. But it wasn't someone else. It was him. The man who had ordered poison to kill his wife. The man who had made the choice to end her life. The man who would now face the consequences. The weight of it was almost unbearable. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as his life crumbled around him. "Do you have anything to say?" the officer asked, his voice low. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There were no words left. Only the suffocating, crushing weight of his actions. The officer stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. He was escorted out of the room, the cold metal cuffs still tight around his wrists. He didn't look up as they led him down the hall, the fluorescent lights above flickering, casting harsh shadows on the walls. He was led through the building, past the doors of the cells, past the quiet whispers of other prisoners. It felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The door to his holding cell creaked open. He was shoved inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed in the hollow space. He stood in the center of the cell, staring at the concrete floor beneath him. The silence was deafening. He sank to his knees, the reality of everything finally hitting him with full force. His mind flashed to his wife's face, her empty eyes, her lifeless body on the couch. He had taken everything from her, and now there was nothing left for him but this cold, empty cell. The walls seemed to close in around him, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. He had no one left, and it would never go away. The cold concrete beneath him felt like a constant reminder of the emptiness inside him. He sat there, his knees drawn to his chest, the silence pressing in from all sides. The distant sounds of the station, the murmur of voices, the clinking of metal, faded to a dull hum. Everything felt far away, distant, as though he was no longer part of the world. His mind was a whirlwind, spinning out of control. How had it come to this? How had the life he had once known unraveled so completely? His wife, the woman he had once promised to love, to cherish, was gone. And he was the one who had taken her. The gravity of his actions crashed down on him in waves, each one more suffocating than the last. He thought of their life together, the small, quiet moments, the laughter, the love they had shared. It all seemed so distant now, like a dream he couldn't hold on to. How could he have gone so far? How could he have made the choice to poison her? The image of her lifeless body flashed before his eyes again. Her once vibrant face now a blank canvas, drained of everything that had made her who she was. He had stolen that from her, and now he had nothing. The cell around him felt like a tomb, cold and unyielding. Every second, every breath, was a reminder of what he had done. There was no escape from the truth, no way to undo it. The hours dragged by in a blur. Time seemed to move differently here, in the sterile, lifeless confines of the holding cell. He could hear the occasional footsteps of guards walking past, but none of them stopped to look at him, to acknowledge him. He was alone with his thoughts, and with the crushing weight of guilt. The door to his cell suddenly opened, breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes still dull, empty. The officer from earlier stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "You've got a visitor," the officer said, his voice distant, almost professional. A visitor? Who could possibly be here for him now? He didn't answer, not sure if he even could. The officer didn't wait for a response. He stepped inside, unshackling his wrists before motioning for him to stand. "Come on," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Let's go." The visitor. His mind raced, but his body was slow to respond. Who would be here for him now? His legs felt weak as he stood, unsteady on his feet. The officer led him down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The visitor, whoever they were, would soon be revealed. But what could they possibly say? What could they offer him now? There was no redemption left for him. Just the cold, harsh truth of his crime, and the bitter reality that he would live with it for the rest of his life. The door to the visitation room creaked open, the sound unnervingly loud in the silent corridor. He stepped inside, still dazed, his body moving on autopilot. The officer behind him gave him a gentle push toward the small table at the center of the room. The visitor was already sitting there, their face partially obscured by the dim light overhead. For a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Could it be someone from his past? Someone who still cared, despite everything? But as his eyes focused, the truth hit him like a gut punch. It was her. His wife's sister, Emily. Her face was a mix of sorrow and anger, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but still burning with a fierceness he couldn't ignore. He froze. It was as if time had stopped. Emily didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her lips pressed tight, her hands clenched in her lap. He swallowed hard, trying to find words, but they stuck in his throat. Her eyes flickered, as though trying to pierce through his very soul. Then, with an almost unnatural calm, she spoke. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting through the air like a knife. The word hung in the room, heavy and sharp.
Why?
How could he possibly answer that? What could he say? His mind felt foggy, every thought tangled up in regret and guilt. He could barely form a coherent sentence.
I didn't.
"I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his voice shaky. Emily's eyes narrowed, and her hand slammed down onto the table, making him flinch. "Didn't mean for it to happen?" Her voice rose, raw with pain. "You planned it. You ordered poison. You waited for the right moment. How could you do that? How could you destroy everything?" He sank into the chair, feeling the weight of her words press down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. She was right. Every word. There was no excuse. No explanation that could ever justify what he had done. Emily shook her head, her face twisted in disbelief. "I thought we were family," she said softly, almost to herself. "But I was wrong. I never thought you'd be capable of this. Of this." The silence that followed was suffocating. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but no words came. There was nothing he could say that would undo the horror he had caused. Emily stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She looked down at him one last time, her face hardening. "You'll rot in here," she said coldly before turning and walking out of the room. The door slammed shut behind her, and he was left alone, once again, with nothing but the bitter truth and the consequences of his actions. The room felt emptier now, the echo of the door slamming still ringing in his ears. He remained seated at the table, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the empty space where Emily had been just moments ago. Her words, cold, final, still burned in his chest. She was right, of course. There was no coming back from what he had done. There was no redemption, no way to undo the choices he had made. He thought back to their life before. Before the poison, before the lies, before the empty promises. There had been love, once. Real love. He remembered how they had laughed together, how they had dreamed of a future that now seemed so distant, so unreachable. It was like watching someone else's life unfold before his eyes. The memories felt distant, blurred through the lens of his guilt. Everything he had taken from her. Everything he had stolen. His chest tightened with the weight of it. There was no escape from it now. The consequences had caught up with him, and they would never let him go. He sank deeper into his seat, his mind spiraling into the abyss of regret. There was no one left to turn to, no one who could save him from the hell he had created. But as the minutes ticked by, something inside him shifted. It wasn't much, just a flicker of thought, but it was there. The realization that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this. He deserved the isolation, the guilt, the punishment. He had brought it upon himself, and it would be his burden to carry for the rest of his life. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the room, bringing him back to the present. A guard appeared in the doorway, looking at him with a mixture of indifference and routine. "Time's up," the guard said. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The guard led him out of the room, through the cold hallways of the prison. Every step felt like a final one, like the end of a long road that had no return. He was no longer the man he once was, and there was no going back.